The thing about disobedience in war is that it only matters if you fail. Success, especially the kind that saves lives, has a way of rewriting the rulebook. On a bitterly cold morning in late March 1945, General George S. Patton stood in his command post staring at a map that showed something his superiors had already decided was impossible. Deep inside enemy territory, beyond multiple German defensive lines, beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations, sat a prisoner of war camp holding Allied soldiers who had been suffering for years. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had reviewed the intelligence reports. He had consulted with his staff, and he had made his position clear. Attempting a rescue would be too costly, too risky, too likely to end in disaster. The answer was no. But Patton had never been particularly good at accepting no for an answer, especially when he believed lives hung in the balance. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and celebrated rescue operations of the entire war. A mission launched without authorization, executed against explicit orders, and carried out with the full knowledge that failure would likely end not just in casualties but in a court-martial. Yet Patton gave the order anyway. He assembled a task force. He sent them into territory where they had no business being, and when they succeeded against all reasonable expectations, he stood ready to face whatever consequences might follow, daring the military establishment to punish him for saving lives they had deemed expendable. The story begins not with Patton's decision but with the prisoners themselves, men who had already endured more than most could imagine. These weren't soldiers captured in the final desperate months of the war. Many had been held since the early years of the conflict, shot down over occupied Europe, captured during failed operations, rounded up from battlefields across North Africa and Italy. They had survived the initial shock of capture, the transport to camps, the brutal adjustment to life behind barbed wire. They had watched friends die from disease, malnutrition, and the casual cruelty that sometimes accompanied captivity. They had learned to survive on meager rations, to navigate the complex social structures that emerge in any long-term prison population, to maintain some thread of hope even as months stretched into years. By early 1945, hope had become a complicated thing. News filtered into the camps through various channels, whispered rumors and carefully concealed radios, suggesting the Allies were winning. The Red Army was pushing from the east. British and American forces were driving through Germany from the west. Liberation seemed inevitable. But inevitable is not the same as imminent, and as the German military situation deteriorated, the prisoners faced a new and terrifying uncertainty. What would happen when the Reich finally collapsed? Would their captors simply abandon the camps, leaving the gates open and the prisoners to fend for themselves in a country torn by war? Would desperate SS units, looking for bargaining chips or simply for revenge, decide that prisoners were more valuable dead than alive? Would the entire camp be force-marched deeper into the shrinking German territory, a death march designed more to inflict suffering than to achieve any military objective? These questions haunted the prisoners as spring approached. They could hear the distant thunder of artillery growing closer. They could see the increasing nervousness of their guards. They knew they were living on borrowed time, but they had no way of knowing whether time would run out before liberation arrived. In one camp in particular, the situation had become especially precarious. Oflag XIII-B, located near Hammelburg in Bavaria, held hundreds of American officers, including a number of senior personnel whose intelligence value or propaganda potential made them particularly important to both sides. The camp's location deep inside what remained of German-held territory meant it sat beyond the immediate reach of advancing Allied forces. Any rescue attempt would require penetrating miles behind enemy lines, navigating through areas still crawling with Wehrmacht units, SS troops, and the desperate remnants of a military machine that had nothing left to lose. Intelligence reports reaching Patton's headquarters painted a grim picture. The camp's guards were becoming increasingly agitated. Supplies had nearly run out. Disease was spreading. And most troubling, there were indications that higher German authorities were considering what to do with the prisoners as Allied forces approached. Some reports suggested the entire population might be evacuated, marched on foot into the mountains where Germany's last-ditch Alpine redoubt was supposedly being prepared. Others hinted at darker possibilities that no one wanted to articulate fully. Patton absorbed these reports with growing anger. He had pushed his Third Army across France faster than many thought possible. He had relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge when others said it couldn't be done. He had forged the Rhine and was now driving deep into Germany. But every victory came with a cost, and he had lost men, friends, soldiers under his command. The thought that American prisoners, officers who had already suffered so much, might die within reach of liberation because official channels deemed rescue too risky struck him as intolerable. He had always viewed warfare through a lens that prioritized aggressive action. Hesitation, in his mind, killed more soldiers than bold maneuvers. But this wasn't just about military philosophy. This was personal in ways that complicated the already complex situation. Among the prisoners at Hammelburg was Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. If that name meant nothing to most of Patton's staff, it meant everything to Patton himself. Waters was his son-in-law, married to Beatrice Patton, the general's daughter. Waters had been captured years earlier during fighting in North Africa, and his presence in the camp added a dimension to Patton's thinking that he would later deny but that everyone around him understood. The possibility that personal motivation might be influencing military judgment made the entire situation even more volatile. A general launching an unauthorized rescue mission was one thing. A general launching an unauthorized rescue mission where his own family member might benefit was something else entirely. Something that could look less like heroism and more like an abuse of power, using military resources and risking soldiers' lives for personal reasons. Patton knew this. He understood the perception problem, and he didn't care. Or perhaps more accurately, he cared deeply but believed the rescue was justified regardless of who was being held in the camp. His argument, the one he would make after the fact when questions inevitably arose, was straightforward. These were American prisoners, officers, men who had served their country and deserved every effort to bring them home. The fact that his son-in-law was among them didn't change the fundamental equation. If anything, it gave him insight into just how urgent the situation had become. But official channels didn't see it that way. When Patton's initial proposals for a rescue mission reached higher headquarters, they were rejected. Eisenhower's staff made the calculation that sending a force deep behind enemy lines to reach a camp that might be liberated anyway in a matter of weeks was an unnecessary risk. Combat operations were proceeding according to plan. German resistance was collapsing. The war would be over soon enough, and prisoners would be freed as camps fell within Allied control. Mounting a special operation, dedicating resources, potentially sacrificing soldiers in a high-risk raid, all for prisoners who were likely to be liberated through normal military advance anyway, didn't make strategic sense. The math was cold but clear. More lives would likely be lost attempting the rescue than would be saved by pulling it off. Therefore, the rescue shouldn't happen. Patton rejected this logic completely. He rejected the arithmetic that weighed probable casualties against probable benefits. He rejected the assumption that prisoners could wait for liberation to arrive on its own schedule. And most fundamentally, he rejected the idea that he needed permission to do what he believed was right. So he made a decision that would define his legacy as much as any of his more celebrated victories. He would send the task force anyway. The planning had to be done carefully, quietly, without leaving too many traces that could be used against him later. He selected Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, one of his most trusted and capable commanders, to organize the operation. Abrams was known for aggressive tactics, for his ability to lead from the front, and for a willingness to take on missions that others considered too dangerous. He was also smart enough to understand what he was being asked to do, and what it might mean for his own career if things went wrong. The mission required assembling a combined arms task force that could move fast, hit hard, and ideally get in and out before German forces could organize an effective response. The force would consist of Sherman tanks, half-tracks carrying infantry, assault guns for fire support, and enough supplies to sustain the operation if it took longer than anticipated. The plan called for the task force to push directly toward Hammelburg, covering roughly 60 miles of enemy-held territory, relying on speed and surprise to avoid getting bogged down in prolonged engagements. Once at the camp, they would free the prisoners, load as many as possible onto the vehicles, and fight their way back to American lines. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a desperate plan that ignored numerous tactical realities and assumed almost everything would go right. The task force rolled out on the night of March 26th. Roughly 300 men in tanks and half-tracks, moving through darkness into territory where they had no support, no reinforcements, and limited intelligence about what they might encounter. From the beginning, problems emerged. Roads that were supposed to be clear turned out to be blocked or defended. German units that intelligence had suggested were demoralized and ineffective fought back with determination. The element of surprise, which the entire operation depended on, began to erode as word of the American column spread through the German defensive network. Radio communications back to Patton's headquarters became sporadic, making it difficult for commanders to understand how the operation was progressing or whether adjustments were needed. But the task force kept moving. Abrams drove his men forward, bypassing resistance where possible, fighting through it where necessary. They covered ground faster than many expected, pushing deeper into enemy territory while German commanders tried to figure out what was happening and how to respond. Was this the spearhead of a major offensive? A diversionary attack meant to draw forces away from the main Allied advance? Or something else entirely? Something smaller but potentially more dangerous? By the time the task force reached Hammelburg, they had already taken casualties. Tanks had been damaged or destroyed. Men had been wounded. Ammunition and fuel, which needed to last for both the approach and the withdrawal, had been expended at rates higher than planned. But they reached the camp. Against all the predictions of those who had opposed the mission, they actually reached the camp. The assault on the camp itself was quick and efficient. Guards were overwhelmed. Fences were breached. And suddenly hundreds of American prisoners, men who had resigned themselves to waiting out the war in captivity, found themselves staring at Sherman tanks and fellow soldiers telling them they were going home. The reaction was chaos mixed with euphoria mixed with disbelief. Some prisoners were too weak to move quickly. Others were suspicious, wondering if this was some kind of trap or trick. Many simply couldn't process what was happening, couldn't shift from the mental state of captivity to the reality of rescue. Abrams and his officers tried to organize the evacuation as efficiently as possible, but there was no efficient way to evacuate several hundred men using a force that had already been reduced by combat and had limited carrying capacity to begin with. This was where the arithmetic that Eisenhower's staff had worried about began to assert itself in the cruelest possible way. There were too many prisoners and not enough vehicles. Even if every tank, every half-track, every available space was packed with rescued POWs, hundreds would have to be left behind or forced to walk. And walking 60 miles back through enemy territory while German forces, now fully alert to the American presence, organized a response was essentially a death sentence. Abrams made the decision to load as many as possible onto the vehicles and to begin the withdrawal immediately, hoping to cover enough ground before German counterattacks materialized. Lieutenant Colonel Waters, the man whose presence had added so much complication to the entire operation, was among the prisoners. He was weak from years of captivity but alive. Whether his presence influenced which prisoners were loaded onto vehicles first, whether special consideration was given because of who his father-in-law was, became yet another question that would later be debated and never fully resolved. What is known is that Waters climbed onto one of the half-tracks, and the column began its retreat. The withdrawal was a nightmare. German forces, having had time to position units and organize ambushes, hit the task force repeatedly. Tank after tank was knocked out. Half-tracks were destroyed. Men who had survived years in prison camps died within hours of liberation, killed in the fighting that erupted as the column tried to fight its way back to American lines. The commander of the task force made desperate decisions, splitting off elements to provide rearguard action, sacrificing mobility for firepower, trying to create enough breathing room for the main body to escape. But the mathematics were relentless. Each engagement cost men, vehicles, ammunition. Each delay allowed German forces to position more units across potential escape routes. By the time dawn broke on March 27th, the situation had become critical. The task force was scattered, low on fuel, nearly out of ammunition, and surrounded by German forces that were systematically closing in. The rescue mission that Patton had launched against orders, the operation that was supposed to demonstrate American commitment to leaving no soldier behind, was collapsing into exactly the kind of disaster that Eisenhower's staff had warned about. Abrams was captured. Many of the men under his command were captured. The prisoners who had been loaded onto the vehicles and who had tasted freedom for a few brief hours found themselves captives again, now facing an uncertain fate at the hands of guards who had just watched their camp get raided. Waters was wounded during the fighting, shot while trying to surrender to German forces who were understandably agitated about the entire situation. The injury was serious enough to require immediate medical attention, which he received from German medical personnel, adding yet another layer of irony to the operation. The man whose presence had contributed to the mission's launch was now wounded and back in enemy hands, arguably worse off than if the rescue had never been attempted. Back at Patton's headquarters, reports of the disaster filtered in slowly and incompletely. Radio silence from the task force. Reconnaissance flights showing destroyed vehicles and prisoners being marched back toward captivity. Intelligence suggesting high casualties among the American rescuers. Patton, who had built a reputation on aggressive action and bold maneuvers, now faced the consequences of a gamble that hadn't paid off. He had defied orders. He had launched an unauthorized mission, and it had failed. The question now was what would happen next, not just to the prisoners who were once again in captivity but to Patton himself. Court-martial was a real possibility. Even if the military hierarchy wanted to avoid the spectacle of putting one of their most famous generals on trial, there were questions that needed answers. Had Patton abused his command authority? Had personal interests influenced military decisions? Had soldiers died unnecessarily because a general couldn't separate his role as a commander from his role as a father-in-law? These questions would have been difficult enough to answer even if the mission had succeeded cleanly. Given the outcome, they became nearly impossible to avoid. But something unexpected happened in the days and weeks that followed. German resistance continued to collapse. Allied forces advanced faster than anticipated. And on April 6, less than 2 weeks after the failed rescue attempt, elements of the 14th Armored Division reached Hammelburg and liberated the camp for real. The prisoners who had been recaptured after the failed rescue were finally freed, along with those who had never been loaded onto the vehicles in the first place. Waters, recovering from his wound, was among them. The war in Europe ended a month later. In the immediate aftermath, attention focused on the casualties and the operational failure. 25 men from the task force had been killed. More than 100 were wounded or captured. Vehicles and equipment worth millions of dollars in wartime terms had been destroyed. By any conventional military assessment, the operation had been a costly mistake that achieved nothing. The prisoners it was supposed to rescue ended up being liberated through normal military operations anyway, exactly as Eisenhower's staff had predicted. Patton should have been censured, perhaps removed from command, certainly held accountable for launching an unauthorized mission that had gotten American soldiers killed. But that's not what happened. Instead, the narrative around the Hammelburg raid began to shift. Soldiers who participated, once recovered from capture, told stories of prisoners weeping with gratitude at the rescue attempt, of men who had been given hope even in the midst of the operation's collapse. Historians began to examine the context more carefully, noting that the outcome, while tragic in its execution, had sent a message about American commitment to its prisoners of war. The operational failure became, in memory, a symbol of something larger than tactical success or failure. This is where the story becomes complicated in ways that simple narratives about heroism or recklessness can't capture. Patton had disobeyed orders. That fact was never in dispute. He had launched a mission that his superiors had explicitly rejected, using resources that weren't his to risk, gambling with soldiers' lives based on calculations that included personal factors he later denied. Everything about the operation violated military discipline and chain of command. Yet he was never court-martialed. He faced no formal consequences. His career continued without significant interruption until his death in a car accident later that year. Why? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about how militaries actually function versus how they're supposed to function. Patton was too valuable, too famous, too useful as a symbol of American military prowess to be brought down over an operation that, however badly executed, had been motivated by a desire to save American lives. The optics of punishing a general for trying to rescue prisoners, even if the rescue failed, were terrible. And perhaps most pragmatically, the war was ending, attention was shifting to occupation and reconstruction, and there was little appetite for dragging one of America's most celebrated commanders through a public tribunal. The prisoners who were actually rescued, in the conventional sense of that term, by regular military operations rather than by Patton's task force, had mixed feelings about what had happened. Some felt the raid had been a noble effort that deserved recognition regardless of outcome. Others believed men had died needlessly for an operation that served more to assuage Patton's conscience than to achieve any meaningful military objective. Waters himself, once recovered, was careful in how he discussed the operation, aware that anything he said would be scrutinized for evidence of either defending his father-in-law or throwing him under the bus. The men who participated in the raid and survived carried their own complicated feelings. They had been asked to do something nearly impossible. They had tried. Many of their friends had died in the attempt. And in the end, the mission they had risked everything for had failed to achieve its immediate objective. Did that make them failures? Or did it make them examples of the kind of courage that attempts difficult things even knowing the odds are against success? These questions don't have clean answers, which is perhaps why the Hammelburg raid remains one of the most debated operations of the entire war. It defies easy categorization. It was simultaneously a heroic rescue attempt and a reckless waste of lives. It was both an example of a commander who cared deeply about his men and an example of a commander who let personal interests cloud military judgment. It demonstrated American commitment to prisoners of war while also demonstrating the limits of what that commitment could practically achieve. And it revealed the uncomfortable reality that in war, as in so much of life, the difference between heroism and foolishness often comes down to outcomes rather than intentions. If the task force had successfully extracted the prisoners and returned without significant casualties, Patton would have been celebrated as a genius who trusted his instincts over bureaucratic caution. Because the operation failed, he became instead a controversial figure who got soldiers killed on a mission that didn't need to happen. The broader lesson, the one that extends beyond this specific operation and speaks to fundamental questions about military leadership, is about the weight of command decisions. Every order a general gives carries consequences. Every operation approved or rejected means soldiers live or die based on judgments that can never be made with perfect information. Patton believed the rescue was worth attempting. Eisenhower believed it wasn't. Both men were working with incomplete intelligence, uncertain projections, and the knowledge that whatever they decided would affect real lives. Eisenhower chose caution. Patton chose action. And because Patton was willing to disobey orders and accept the consequences, we can examine what happened when those two philosophies collided. The cost was real. 25 families received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands or fathers had been killed in action during a raid that most of the country never heard about. Hundreds more soldiers experienced the trauma of being captured, of fighting and losing, of watching friends die in an operation that ultimately changed nothing about when the camp was liberated. Those costs can't be waved away or dismissed as acceptable casualties for a noble cause. They were human beings who died or were wounded because one general decided he knew better than his superiors. But there's another side to this accounting, one that can't be measured in casualty reports or after-action reviews. Every prisoner in that camp, even those who were recaptured after the failed rescue, knew that someone had tried. In the darkest moment of their captivity, as the war ground toward its conclusion and their fate remained uncertain, someone had sent tanks and soldiers and taken casualties trying to get them out. That knowledge, that awareness that they hadn't been forgotten, had value that's impossible to quantify. It didn't shorten their captivity. It didn't prevent the suffering they endured. But it told them something about how their own side viewed them, about whether they were considered worth saving or merely unfortunate losses to be recovered when convenient. Patton's raid, for all its operational failures, sent a message. Whether that message was worth the lives lost to send it is a question each person has to answer for themselves, weighing values that can't be reduced to tactical math. And that's perhaps the most lasting legacy of Hammelburg, the reason the story still resonates decades after the last prisoner came home and the last soldier who participated passed away. It forces us to confront questions about what we owe each other, about when rules should be followed and when they should be broken, about the price of loyalty and the cost of caution. There are no clear answers, which is precisely why the story matters. Patton never apologized for launching the raid. He never expressed regret for defying orders or for the casualties that resulted. When questioned, he maintained that the operation had been militarily justified, that the prisoners were in immediate danger, that waiting for normal military operations to reach the camp risked leaving American soldiers to die or disappear into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Whether he actually believed this or whether it was the public position he maintained while privately wrestling with doubts is something we'll never know. What we do know is that he died without facing formal consequences for his disobedience, without being held accountable in any official sense for a mission that violated every protocol about chain of command and proper authorization. His reputation, already complex and controversial, absorbed the Hammelburg raid as one more data point in the endless debate about whether he was a brilliant commander or a reckless egomanist. The truth, as is so often the case, is that he was both, and the raid exemplified all his strengths and weaknesses simultaneously. And perhaps that's the final lesson here, the understanding that comes from sitting with this story long enough to move past simple judgments. War doesn't produce clean moral victories. Leadership doesn't offer clear choices between right and wrong. And the men who make decisions that affect thousands of lives are just that, men, flawed and complicated and struggling with impossible responsibilities. Patton saw prisoners suffering and sent soldiers to rescue them, knowing he was defying orders and risking lives. Some of those soldiers died. Some prisoners were temporarily freed. All of them were eventually liberated when the war ended weeks later. Whether the raid was worth it depends entirely on what you value and how you calculate the worth of human life and human dignity and human loyalty. History records the facts but can't settle the moral equation. That's left to each generation to wrestle with, to debate, to use as a lens for examining their own beliefs about duty and disobedience, and the terrible weight of command.